Hello. In this video, I'm going to go through the 5 most basic checkmating patterns you need to know as a beginner in order to start consistently winning your chess games and understanding how to convert a winning position into actual checkmate. So the first checkmate we're going to go through is the ladder checkmate with 2 queens. This obviously assumes that you've promoted a pawn into a queen or promoted 2 pawns into queens. For more information on how to actually promote a pawn into a queen safely in the endgame, that'll be shown later on in this video. But for now, we're just going to quickly show how to do the technique for a ladder checkmate. So the idea of the ladder checkmate is we're going to have to push the king to one of the edges of the board in order to actually deliver the checkmate. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to need both of our queens. One of the queens, let's say we're going to push the king up. One of the queens needs to have the job of cutting the king off from running further from the edge, while the other queen will have the responsibility of delivering the actual check that continues to push the king to the edge of the board. So to show how I'm going to do that, I'll start by doing exactly what I showed and moving one queen to cut off this row from the black king. Now let's say the black king just moves, let's say he moves this way, closer to the edge. What we can actually do here is using this queen, just keep the king cut off from running further down. Okay, so now that we have the king cut off on this row, we're going to use our other queen and deliver a check on this row so that the king has to move up. So we can do that here. Say the king moves up. We're going to use our first queen, deliver the check again. And then once the king moves to the edge of the board, we'll use this queen to deliver the checkmate. Keeping in mind that this queen is here to cut him off from being able to run down. So that's the most basic checkmate, also known as ladder mate. Just to quickly kind of explain what's going to happen. It's going to, once you get it set up like this, where the 2 queens are on rows next to each other, then they're going to start alternating where this one gives the check, king moves up, the other one gives a check, king moves up, and then the other queen. So you alternate the queens in this mate. Not sure if I over-explained that, but just showing how to do this ladder checkmate for a beginner. So the second basic checkmate we're going to show is another version of the ladder mate, just this time with 2 rooks instead of 2 queens. It's the same technique where we're going to have one rook cut off the king and the other one deliver the check. We just have to be careful that the king doesn't capture one of our rooks while we do this. So for the sake of this example, I'm going to actually push the king to the right. And I can start by using this rook to cut the king off. I'm going to need to position my other rook better, so I'm just going to move it all the way down here, like so. I want to continue moving the king this way, so I'm going to use this rook to cut the king off. And here's where it's different than the 2 queens, because the king is actually able to attack my rook. But it's pretty simple to deal with this. I'm just going to have to slide it to the opposite end of the board where he can no longer reach. And then we're just going to go proceed with our ladder checkmate technique like before with the 2 queens. And here we can't deliver the mate because the king can capture a rook. So again, we just have to slide down, and we can deliver checkmate as such. So ladder checkmate can be done with 2 queens or 2 rooks or 1 queen and 1 rook. This is probably the most basic checkmating pattern to understand. All you need is at least 2 rooks or a queen and a rook or a queen and a pawn, and then you'd be able to get this position set up and end the game this way. So this is the second basic checkmate you need to know as a beginner. The third basic checkmate we're going to need to know is actually going to be the first checkmate just a little further back, where instead of having 2 queens, we have 1 queen and 1 pawn that we want to promote into a queen. Now, it is actually possible to promote with just the queen and the king, and we're going to show how to do that for the next checkmate. But when you have a pawn available, it's usually easiest just to promote that pawn into a second queen and then delivering the ladder mate, as demonstrated in the first checkmate. So the technique I'm going to go about this is I'm going to use my queen to try and cut off the king from ever stopping this pawn from promoting. I'm going to start by playing queen a3 with the goal of putting my queen on the c file to cut the king off. And now that the queen is safely here, I can basically just pre-move my pawn all the way down the board to promote it, since the king can never go and stop this pawn. And now that I have the 2 queens, I can just go through with the ladder checkmate technique that I did before. So I'm going to try to push the king up the board this way. In order to do that, I can bring my queen down here to cut off the king, and then we'll just start doing the ladder like this, and that is checkmate. So it's pretty simple. Just use your queen to cut off the king, promote the pawn, make the second queen, and go do ladder checkmate. This is essentially just the first checkmate taken further back in the game. I tried to lay out these checkmates in a progression from the easiest to slightly more and more difficult. So I hope that makes sense. And for the 4th basic checkmating pattern, I'm going to explain how to checkmate the king with just a king and a queen. This is slightly different than the ladder checkmate from before, because the queen alone won't as easily be able to push the king into the edge of the board. The way I prefer to do this myself is to use the queen to push the king into a corner where the king only has 2 squares he can move between. And then once I get to that point, I'll just start walking my king over to where I can deliver checkmate. That should make more sense once I show the final position. But just to now show the technique, I'm going to use this queen, and I'm going to keep moving it to where it cuts the king off slowly into one of the 4 corners of the board. So the first move I'm going to do is queen a4 here. A little tip you can use here for this technique is the queen should never have to deliver check unless it's actually for the checkmate. So in this case, there's no point delivering the check because then the king will just slip away. I'm just going to keep moving the queen into this knight opposition. So this like, the way the knight moves, 2 squares, 1 over. Keep putting the queen in opposition like that. Keep putting the queen there. In this case, he's already in opposition. I can just move my king as a waiting move. I'm going to use my queen to cut off the king. Slowly push him into the corner again. Knight's opposition. So now the king's on the edge of the board, which is where I want him. So what I can do again is using the queen's knight opposition. I'm going to push this king up into this corner. If I move the queen up here, he only has 1 legal move. Again, if I move the queen here, he only has 1 legal move. And now here is where you have to be very careful. If I move the queen again, the king is not going to have any legal moves, and it's actually going to be stalemate instead of a win, which would not be the result we want with white here. This king right now only has 2 legal squares he can walk back and forth between. So basically at this stage, I can just walk my king all the way over here without any worry. And now my king is here. Bunch of different ways to deliver checkmate. I'm going to do it like this. And now we have checkmate using just a queen. And for the 5th and final checkmating pattern you need to know, and the most difficult one to understand, we're going to show how to checkmate with just a king and a pawn. Now obviously the pawn is just a pawn. It's not going to be enough to deliver checkmate. We're actually going to need to safely promote this into a queen and then deliver the checkmate using just the king and the queen like we showed in the last example. The challenge in this position is correctly escorting this pawn into the promotion square without stalemating the king into a draw. Where a lot of people would go wrong in this position when I first show this to them is they try pushing the pawn first. And I'll just quickly show what happens if we play this out. But if I lead with the pawn, what's going to end up happening is a situation where we're never going to kick this king away from the promotion square. And the game's going to end up in stalemate like this. So this is a draw, which is not what we want given that this was a winnable position. So leading with the pawn is actually a very common mistake in this position. What we actually need to do is we need to lead with the king, which kind of ties into one of the most important endgame concepts, that your king activity is one of the most important things in the endgame to think about. A lot of people go wrong, and in the endgame, they never move the king, and they just move pawns and pieces, when really getting your king into the action in the endgame is extremely important, and the king becomes one of the strongest pieces in the endgame as well. So to actually demonstrate how to convert this endgame for a win, the first thing you got to think is your king has to be in front of the pawn in order to do this escort. So first of all, I'm going to start by moving the king first. And then what we have to be very careful of is the concept known as opposition. Opposition is this scenario where the kings are standing off from each other. This is going to be difficult to explain, but what you have to remember is whoever steps into the opposition being when they're on the same file, like with one square in between them. So in this case, if I move my king to d4, I am the one who stepped into opposition, and then black is forced to walk out of it. So whoever steps into opposition in these endgames is the one who is going to get the result they want, for no better words. If black were to be the one to step into opposition, he's going to end up with a draw. If white steps into opposition, white's going to end up with a win. So to keep demonstrating, I'm going to step into the opposition here. And now in this position, we can just keep walking back and forth, but then we're not making any progress. So now that the king has stepped out of the opposition, we're going to want to flank the other way to prevent him from walking back. So the move here would actually be to put the king on e5. And now that the king has stepped back, once again, we can step into the opposition. Continue the technique here. One huge mistake to avoid, in this position would be pushing the pawn 2 squares. If you're watching, see if you can figure out why. Try to post your answer in the comments. Why pushing d4 would be a bad move here. You can go ahead and pause and think about it if you'd like. I'll reveal the answer right now. If we play d4, black gets to step into the opposition. And just to show what actually happens, so you don't just take my word for it, if he steps into the opposition here, we end up with a situation where I need to step out of the opposition, and he can just basically keep following me forever. And I'm never going to be able to make any more progress, and this is a draw. So that's something you always want to think about as white. If you push the pawn, make sure you at least have a waiting move available, like play d3 here. Or just make sure that black is not going to be stepping into opposition, like he was in that last case. So we saw d4 was a huge mistake here because then the king steps into opposition and the game's a draw. Instead, we have two options. We can either flank or we can move the pawn 1 square. I'm going to move the pawn 1 square. Here, king moved back. I'll step into opposition again. I have two waiting moves here with the pawn, so there's no problem moving it once, letting him step in. And here, again, another waiting move. He just stepped into opposition, but I can wait. So by playing a waiting move, he'll step out, I go flank, and then we promote the pawn now that the king is here. And now that we're in this position, we just go back through the king and queen checkmating pattern that I showed in the last part, where once we get the king to these last two squares, we can basically just pre-move our king all the way here and deliver mate. This is definitely the most complicated of all the checkmating patterns I've shown. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I will definitely try to answer and help out. Or just go back through and watch my technique and see how I explain the moves. But this is more on the intermediate side than the beginner side. Don't worry if you're a beginner and you don't perfectly understand this technique. But I will link this study to the Lichess, or I will leave a link to this Lichess study in the comment or in the description, so that if you want, you can practice all of these on your own. And that way, you know that in your games, once you get a winning position, you know exactly how you're going to convert it into a win, which will just build more confidence, lead to better results, and hopefully lead to you climbing a lot more. And that's it for this video. Those are 5 checkmating patterns that you really need to know as a beginner to start consistently winning your games. This is the first video I'm planning in a series of endgame videos that'll start at a more beginner level and slowly get more and more intermediate, so that if you want to improve your endgame, there'll be a series available on my channel for you to go through. But until next time, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have good luck in your future chess games, and thank you very much.